What happens when a president who never commanded troops in battle makes a decision so bold that even a five-star general questions everything he thought he knew about American power? In the spring of 1945, as Allied forces pushed deeper into the heart of Nazi Germany, General Dwight David Eisenhower stood at the pinnacle of military achievement, commanding the largest invasion force in human history, orchestrating the defeat of Hitler's Third Reich with precision that would define modern warfare. Yet within months, this same man would witness a transformation in presidential authority that would shake the very foundations of how America projected force across the globe. Harry S. Truman, the haberdasher from Independence, Missouri, who had never graduated from college and whose military experience consisted of commanding an artillery battery in World War I, was about to redefine what it meant to hold power in the atomic age. On August 6, 1945, at exactly 8:15 in the morning, the Enola Gay released its payload over Hiroshima, and in that blinding flash of light, the relationship between civilian leadership and military command changed forever. Eisenhower, who had spent his entire adult life studying warfare, logistics, and strategy, found himself confronting a reality where traditional military wisdom had become almost obsolete overnight. The question wasn't whether America possessed superior firepower anymore, but rather who controlled that firepower and under what circumstances it could be unleashed. This wasn't just about weapons or technology or even victory in war. This was about the fundamental nature of democracy itself, about whether the American system could survive the terrible burden of possessing the power to end civilization. And if you're intrigued by this hidden chapter of history where two very different men navigated the most dangerous transition in American leadership, then subscribe to this channel right now, hit that like button to help more people discover these untold stories, share this video with anyone who needs to understand how our modern world was truly shaped, and leave a comment telling us what surprised you most about this moment in history. The tension between Truman and Eisenhower didn't begin with atomic weapons, though those devices would eventually crystallize every disagreement between them into stark relief. In July 1945, during the Potsdam Conference outside Berlin, Eisenhower first learned that Truman had decided to use the atomic bomb against Japan without consulting the military leadership about the strategic necessity of such a weapon. Secretary of War Henry Stimson pulled Eisenhower aside in a villa overlooking the ruins of the German capital and casually mentioned that the United States had successfully tested a new weapon of unprecedented destructive power in the New Mexico desert just days earlier. Eisenhower's response was immediate and visceral, later recorded in his personal memoirs. He told Stimson that he believed Japan was already defeated, that the weapon was unnecessary, and that America should avoid shocking world opinion by using such a device. But Truman had already made his decision, not as a general evaluating tactical options, but as a president weighing political, diplomatic, and human costs that extended far beyond the battlefield. The fundamental disagreement wasn't about whether the bomb would work or even whether it would end the war quickly, but rather about who possessed the authority to make such a civilization-altering choice and on what basis that choice should be made. Eisenhower represented the old guard, military men who had risen through decades of service, who understood war as a continuation of politics through violence, who believed that professional soldiers should determine how wars were fought even if politicians determined why they were fought. Truman represented something entirely new, a democratic leader who insisted that in a republic, elected civilians must maintain absolute control over military force, especially when that force had become so devastating that its use transcended mere military calculation. The constitutional question seemed simple on paper. The president was commander-in-chief, and that settled the matter. But constitutional text couldn't capture the psychological and institutional shock of watching a former artillery captain overrule the strategic judgment of men like Eisenhower, Douglas MacArthur, and William Leahy, men whose understanding of warfare had been forged in the crucible of 2 world wars. Over the next 5 years, as Truman made one controversial decision after another, from recognizing Israel within minutes of its declaration of independence on May 14, 1948, to firing MacArthur in April 1951, to integrating the armed forces through Executive Order 9981 in July 1948, Eisenhower watched and learned. What he learned would change not just his own thinking about power, but the entire trajectory of American leadership in the second half of the 20th century. The Korean War brought every theoretical tension between civilian and military authority crashing into brutal reality on the frozen hills and valleys of a peninsula most Americans couldn't locate on a map. When North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel on June 25, 1950, Truman faced a choice that would have been unthinkable just 5 years earlier: committing American forces to combat without a declaration of war from Congress, based solely on his authority as commander-in-chief and America's obligations to the newly formed United Nations. Eisenhower, who had retired from active duty and was serving as president of Columbia University in New York City, watched these developments with growing concern, not because he disagreed with defending South Korea, but because he recognized that Truman was establishing precedents that would reshape executive power for generations. The decision to intervene in Korea came not from the Pentagon or the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but from a small group of advisors meeting with Truman at Blair House on the evening of June 25, with the president making his final determination before consulting the military leadership about feasibility or strategy. This was civilian control of the military taken to its logical conclusion, and it terrified many professional soldiers who had spent their careers believing that their expertise in warfare entitled them to determine how and when American forces would fight. But Truman wasn't finished reshaping the landscape of American power. When General Douglas MacArthur, the hero of the Pacific War and the architect of Japan's reconstruction, began publicly disagreeing with Truman's limited war strategy in Korea, insisting that there was no substitute for victory, and advocating for expanding the war into China, the president faced a choice that would define his legacy and establish the boundaries of military authority in American democracy. On April 11, 1951, Truman relieved MacArthur of command, not because the general's military judgment was wrong, but because he had violated the fundamental principle that military officers must subordinate their strategic preferences to civilian political authority. Eisenhower, watching from the sidelines, saw something profound in this moment. Truman, widely considered one of the weakest and most unpopular presidents in American history at that time, had just defeated one of the most popular and accomplished military leaders in the nation's history, and the constitutional order had held. The precedent was staggering in its implications, establishing beyond any doubt that in the American system, a haberdasher from Missouri could overrule a five-star general, not because of superior military knowledge, but because of superior constitutional authority. The atomic age demanded this kind of centralized control, even if it made professional soldiers uncomfortable and even if it concentrated terrifying power in the hands of one elected official. By 1952, the United States possessed a nuclear arsenal capable of destroying every major city in the Soviet Union within hours, and the Soviets were rapidly developing their own stockpile of world-ending weapons. Eisenhower, who was now being courted by both political parties to run for president, understood that Truman had fundamentally transformed the presidency into something the founders could never have imagined, an office that combined constitutional authority with the physical capability to end human civilization through unilateral decision-making. The National Security Act of 1947, passed during Truman's first term, had already restructured the entire American defense establishment, creating the Department of Defense, the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Council, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff as a permanent body. These weren't just bureaucratic reforms. They represented Truman's vision of a presidency equipped with the institutional tools necessary to wage the Cold War, to make split-second decisions about nuclear weapons, to conduct covert operations around the globe, all while maintaining the fiction of congressional oversight and democratic accountability. Eisenhower watched as Truman used these new tools with increasing boldness, authorizing the CIA to conduct covert operations in Iran, Italy, and the Philippines, approving the development of the hydrogen bomb over the objections of scientific advisors like J. Robert Oppenheimer, establishing a permanent peacetime draft, committing American forces to defend Western Europe through NATO, creating a national security state that operated in shadows that would have horrified Thomas Jefferson or James Madison. The transformation wasn't subtle or gradual. It was a wholesale reimagining of executive power designed to meet the unique threats of the atomic age. And here's where the story reaches its crucial midpoint, where Eisenhower begins to see not just the necessity of Truman's revolution in presidential authority, but also its profound dangers. And if you're following this journey of discovery with us, this is the perfect moment to subscribe to our channel so you never miss these deep dives into the hidden forces that shaped our modern world. Smash that like button to show YouTube this content matters. Share this video with someone who thinks they understand presidential power but hasn't heard this story, and drop a comment about which aspect of this transformation surprises you most or challenges what you thought you knew about American democracy. When Eisenhower entered the Oval Office on January 20, 1953, he carried with him not just the military experience of a supreme Allied commander, but the hard-won understanding that Truman had been right about the fundamental structure of power in the modern age, even if his execution had sometimes been flawed or politically costly. The irony was rich. The professional soldier had become president, but he would govern as an even more committed believer in civilian supremacy than his civilian predecessor. Eisenhower's first major test came in 1954, when French forces were surrounded at Dien Bien Phu in Vietnam, and both the French government and some of Eisenhower's own advisors, including Vice President Richard Nixon and Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, urged immediate American military intervention, possibly including the use of tactical nuclear weapons. The old Eisenhower, the general who had commanded millions of men in combat, might have seen this as a straightforward military problem requiring a military solution. But the new Eisenhower, the president who had internalized Truman's lessons about the political dimensions of military force, refused to intervene without congressional approval and without Allied support, effectively allowing France's colonial empire in Indochina to collapse rather than risk another Korea or worse. This wasn't military timidity. It was presidential wisdom born from watching Truman navigate the treacherous waters of limited war and political constraint. Eisenhower had learned that possessing overwhelming military power meant nothing if you couldn't articulate clear political objectives, build domestic support, and understand when force would create more problems than it solved. Throughout his 8 years in office, Eisenhower would repeatedly choose restraint over action, understanding as Truman had understood that in the nuclear age, the most important military decision was often the decision not to use military force at all. He refused to intervene militarily when Soviet tanks crushed the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, despite enormous pressure from conservative Republicans and Eastern European émigré communities. He relied on the CIA and covert action rather than overt military force to overthrow governments in Iran and Guatemala, understanding that American power worked most effectively when it operated below the threshold of public awareness and international condemnation. He resisted pressure from the Joint Chiefs of Staff to launch preventive war against the Soviet Union while America still possessed nuclear superiority, recognizing that such a war would destroy the very civilization it purported to defend. The most revealing moment of Eisenhower's presidency came not in a moment of action, but in a moment of calculated inaction that demonstrated how completely he had absorbed Truman's revolution in presidential power. On May 1, 1960, a Soviet surface-to-air missile shot down an American U-2 spy plane over Soviet territory, capturing pilot Francis Gary Powers alive and exposing years of secret American aerial reconnaissance over the USSR. Eisenhower faced immediate pressure to deny American responsibility, to claim the plane had drifted off course during a weather research mission, to do anything except admit that the President of the United States had personally authorized repeated violations of Soviet airspace for espionage purposes. Instead, after an initial cover story collapsed when the Soviets produced the pilot and the wreckage, Eisenhower made the unprecedented decision to publicly acknowledge and defend the espionage program, asserting that as president, he had the authority to order such missions in defense of American security, and that he would continue to order them as long as the Soviet Union maintained a closed society that threatened American interests. This was Truman's vision of presidential power taken to its logical conclusion. The president not only possessed the authority to make life-and-death decisions about war and peace, but also to conduct secret operations that violated international law, and to do so on his own authority as commander-in-chief and chief executive. The U-2 incident destroyed a planned summit with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev in Paris and ended any hope for détente during Eisenhower's presidency, but it established once and for all that American presidents operated under different rules than other democratic leaders. That they possessed a combination of constitutional authority and practical capability that made them, in effect, elected monarchs in the realm of national security. Eisenhower's willingness to publicly own this authority, to defend it as necessary and proper, showed how far he had come from his initial skepticism about Truman's expansion of presidential power. He had learned that in the Cold War, in the atomic age, there was no alternative to centralized, secretive, often unilateral presidential decision-making about matters of war, peace, espionage, and nuclear weapons. Congress couldn't be trusted with such decisions because Congress couldn't keep secrets and couldn't act with sufficient speed. The public couldn't be trusted because the public didn't have access to classified intelligence and couldn't be expected to support necessary but morally ambiguous actions. Even the military couldn't be fully trusted because military leaders had parochial interests in their own services and their own preferred strategies that might not align with broader national interests. Yet even as Eisenhower embraced this transformation in presidential authority, he recognized its profound dangers with a clarity that would only be fully appreciated decades later. In the final weeks of his presidency, as he prepared to hand power to the young senator from Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy, Eisenhower spent long hours with his speechwriters crafting what would become the most famous presidential farewell address since George Washington warned against foreign entanglements in 1796. On the evening of January 17, 1961, sitting in the Oval Office with cameras rolling, Eisenhower delivered a warning that drew directly from his 8 years of wielding the kind of power Truman had created and that he himself had refined. He warned of the military-industrial complex, a phrase that would echo through American political discourse for generations, describing the permanent alliance between the Defense Department, defense contractors, congressional committees, and research universities that had grown up around the national security state. But Eisenhower's warning went deeper than simple concern about waste or corruption. He was identifying the systemic pressures that would push every president toward military solutions, toward increased defense spending, toward permanent mobilization and permanent crisis. The very structure of power that Truman had built and that Eisenhower had operated was creating its own momentum, its own logic that transcended the intentions or wisdom of any individual president. Eisenhower understood, as perhaps only a soldier-turned-president could understand, that the institutional forces unleashed by the Cold War and the atomic age wouldn't simply disappear when the crisis passed, that Americans were creating a permanent warfare state that would persist regardless of whether the Soviet threat justified it. He warned against allowing the scientific technological elite to dominate public policy, recognizing that expertise in nuclear physics or missile design didn't translate into wisdom about human affairs or democratic governance. He cautioned that we must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes, acknowledging that the very system he had managed for 8 years posed an existential threat to the constitutional order it purported to defend. This wasn't hypocrisy. It was hard-won wisdom from a man who had seen both the necessity of centralized presidential power in the modern age and the terrible dangers that power posed to democratic accountability and constitutional limits. The relationship between Truman and Eisenhower remained complicated until Truman's death in 1972, marked by periods of bitter estrangement and eventual reconciliation that mirrored the nation's own conflicted feelings about the transformation these two men had jointly created. During the 1952 campaign, Eisenhower had distanced himself from Truman's record, allowing his supporters to attack Truman's handling of Korea, his firing of MacArthur, his tolerance of communist infiltration in government, all the decisions that had made Truman the most unpopular president in modern polling history. Truman never fully forgave Eisenhower for what he saw as a betrayal, for failing to defend the very achievements and precedents that Eisenhower himself would later rely upon as president. But by the 1960s, as both men entered their final years, a grudging mutual respect emerged, born from the recognition that they had together navigated the most dangerous transition in American history, the passage from a conventional military power to a nuclear superpower, from a republic that declared wars and mobilized for them to an empire that maintained permanent military forces around the globe and conducted secret wars without congressional approval. Neither man had sought this transformation. Both had been swept up in forces larger than themselves, forces unleashed by Hitler's aggression, by Stalin's expansion, by the Manhattan Project's success, by the bipolar world that emerged from the ruins of World War II. Yet both had made crucial choices that shaped how America would wield power for the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. Truman had insisted on absolute civilian control at the very moment when military force became almost unimaginably powerful, establishing the principle that democratic accountability mattered more than military expertise in the most consequential decisions. Eisenhower had refined and legitimized that system, showing that it could work even under a president with deep military experience, that the issue wasn't civilians versus soldiers but rather constitutional authority versus institutional expertise. Together, they had created the template for the imperial presidency, the national security state, the permanent warfare economy, all the structures that would define American power through Vietnam, through the Reagan buildup, through the War on Terror, through the present day. Whether this was a necessary adaptation to dangerous times or a tragic abandonment of Republican principles remains one of the central questions of American political life. What Eisenhower ultimately realized, watching Truman redefine military power and then experiencing that redefined power himself, was that modern democracy faced an almost unsolvable paradox. The founders had designed a system of checks and balances, of divided powers, of slow deliberation and broad consensus, precisely to prevent the concentration of authority that could lead to tyranny. But the atomic age demanded exactly the kind of concentrated authority the founders had feared, required that one person possess the power to launch nuclear weapons in minutes, to conduct covert operations without congressional knowledge, to commit forces to combat without declarations of war, to maintain a permanent military establishment that would have horrified Madison and Jefferson. Eisenhower saw that you couldn't have both the old constitutional order and survival in the Cold War. Something had to give, and what gave was the careful balance of powers that had defined American democracy for its first century and a half. The question wasn't whether this transformation was good or bad in some abstract sense, but whether Americans could maintain enough democratic spirit, enough skepticism about concentrated power, enough civic engagement to prevent the national security state from consuming the very freedoms it existed to protect. This was the insight that drove Eisenhower's farewell address, the recognition that the structures he and Truman had built were necessary but also dangerous, that they required eternal vigilance and constant questioning to prevent them from becoming the very tyranny America opposed in its enemies. The military-industrial complex wasn't an aberration or a conspiracy. It was the logical outcome of maintaining permanent military mobilization in a democratic society, the inevitable result of telling millions of Americans that their jobs, their communities, their economic security depended on continued defense spending and continued external threats. And once that complex was in place, it developed its own political power, its own ability to shape public discourse, its own interest in perpetuating the very threats that justified its existence. Eisenhower understood that he was handing to his successors not just the awesome power to defend America, but also the terrible burden of resisting the pressures to misuse that power, to see every problem as a military problem, to confuse America's security interests with the institutional interests of the national security establishment. Whether Kennedy and Johnson and Nixon and all the presidents who followed could maintain that distinction, could wield power without being consumed by it, remained an open question. The legacy of what Truman created and Eisenhower legitimized continues to shape American power and American democracy in ways that would have seemed like science fiction to the founders and that seem utterly normal to contemporary Americans who have never known a world without a massive Defense Department, without permanent military bases scattered across the globe, without a president who can order drone strikes in Yemen or special operations raids in Syria without seeking congressional approval. Every president since Eisenhower has operated within the framework these two men established, has drawn upon the authority Truman claimed and the precedents Eisenhower set, from Kennedy's secret war in Laos to Johnson's escalation in Vietnam to Nixon's bombing of Cambodia to Reagan's aid to the Contras to both Bush's wars in Iraq to Obama's drone program to Trump's maximum pressure campaigns. The imperial presidency became so normalized that contemporary debates about executive power often treat Truman-era precedents as if they were part of the original constitutional design, as if the founders intended presidents to possess the kind of unilateral war-making authority that would have seemed monarchical to the generation that fought the revolution. And perhaps most troublingly, the system has proven remarkably resistant to reform, because the kind of power Truman claimed and Eisenhower wielded feels necessary in a dangerous world, and because dismantling that power would require Americans to accept greater risk, greater uncertainty, greater vulnerability than modern political culture seems willing to tolerate. Every reform proposal runs into the same wall. What happens when the next crisis comes, when speed and secrecy and decisive action seem essential to survival, when the careful deliberation the founders valued becomes a luxury we cannot afford? Eisenhower never found an answer to this dilemma, and neither has any president since. The best he could do was warn future generations about the dangers, urge continued vigilance, and hope that American democracy retained enough vitality to resist the pressures toward permanent mobilization and permanent expansion of executive power. Whether that hope was justified remains one of the central questions of our political moment, as we continue to grapple with the consequences of decisions made in the 1940s and 1950s by two very different men who found themselves managing a transformation in power that neither fully understood and that we still haven't fully processed. And if this exploration of how our modern world was truly shaped has given you new insight into the forces that govern our lives, then this is your moment to subscribe to this channel for more revelations about the hidden architecture of power. Hit that like button to ensure more people discover these crucial stories. Share this video with anyone who needs to understand where presidential authority really comes from and what it costs us. And leave a comment sharing what you learned or what questions this raises about how we govern ourselves in an age of permanent crisis and concentrated power.